the sun and the moon. In a time when the world was younger and the mountains of the peninsula were deeper than they are today, there lived a woman. She was a widow whose life was a rhythmic cycle of labor and devotion, bound to the two young souls waiting for her in a small thatched cottage at the edge of the forest. The day had been long. She had spent it in the village below, helping with a feast at a wealthy nobleman's house. As a reward for her tireless hands, she carried atop her head a heavy woven basket filled with fresh tteok, white as the winter moon and sweet with the promise of a full stomach for her children. But the sun was a fickle companion. By the time she reached the mouth of the mountain pass, the light had begun to bleed from the sky, turning the vibrant greens of the pines into a murky, suffocating indigo. The mountain, known to the locals as a spine of ancient spirits, felt different tonight. Usually, the wind whispered. Tonight, it seemed to hold its breath. The only sound was the rhythmic thud of her straw sandals against the cooling earth and the occasional sharp crack of a dry twig. Noises that felt dangerously loud in the deepening void. Fatigue clung to her limbs like the mountain mist, yet she pressed on. Each step took her further from the flickering warmth of the village lanterns and deeper into the primordial silence of the peaks. She knew these paths by heart, yet the shadows seemed to stretch and shift, lengthening into jagged claws that reached across her trail. A sudden chill, sharper than the evening air, crawled up her spine. She paused, her breath hitching in her throat. The forest was too still. No crickets sang, no owls called. There was only the oppressive weight of the unseen, watching from behind the gnarled trunks of the ancient oaks. She adjusted the basket, her fingers trembling slightly against the rough wood. Home was still many ridges away, and between her and her children lay 9 steep passes, territories where the line between the world of men and the world of beasts grew perilously thin. Deep in the thicket, a pair of amber eyes ignited, catching the last dying ember of the sun. The hunt had not yet begun, but the mountain had already claimed its first victim, the silence. The first pass was known as the Gateway of Sighs. As the woman began her ascent, the mist thickened, coiling around her ankles like white vipers. It was here that the silence she had feared finally broke, not with a sound of nature, but with a low, guttural vibration that seemed to emanate from the very roots of the mountain. From the shifting fog, he emerged. He was not merely a tiger, he was a mountain god gone sour, a mass of golden fur and midnight stripes that stood taller than any man. His eyes were twin lanterns of malice, burning with a hunger that surpassed the physical. He did not roar. Instead, his presence demanded a toll. The woman felt the weight of his gaze on the basket atop her head. Each tteok was a day of her life, a piece of her children's future. But the beast's stare turned the sweet tteok into the only currency for her survival. With trembling hands, she cast the first offering into the dirt. The tiger vanished into the shadows with the prize, leaving behind only the scent of wet fur and ancient dust. But the mountain was a greedy master. At the second pass, the shadow returned, then the third, and the fourth. By the 5th pass, the basket was light, but her heart was leaden. The ritual became a rhythmic nightmare. The appearance of the amber eyes, the silent demand, the frantic sacrifice of the white tteok, and the temporary retreat of the beast. With every pass, the tiger grew bolder, his breath hot against the nape of her neck, his claws clicking rhythmically against the stones like a countdown. By the 9th and final pass, the basket was empty. The last of the tteok, the promise of her children's supper, had been consumed by the mountain's insatiable maw. The woman stood at the crest of the final ridge, her breath coming in ragged gasps, the lights of her distant cottage barely visible through the trees. She had no more bread to give. But as the tiger stepped out from the darkness one last time, his form now larger and more grotesque than before, she realized with a cold, numbing clarity that the beast had never truly been hunting the tteok. He had been savoring the scent of her fear, waiting for the moment when she had nothing left to offer but herself. The moon, finally breaking through the clouds, cast a long, jagged shadow of the beast across the path, swallowing the woman whole before he even made his move. Far from the blood-stained snow of the final pass, the small cottage stood as a fragile sanctuary against the encroaching night. Inside, the brother and sister huddled near the dying embers of the hearth. The crackle of the wood was the only barrier against the heavy, suffocating silence of the forest. They moved in whispers, their ears strained for the sound of a familiar footfall, their hearts tethered to the gate at the edge of the yard. But on the mountain path, a grotesque transformation was complete. The beast had not been content with a mere meal. He had gathered the remnants of the woman, her silk headscarf, her worn bodice, her scent, and draped them over his predatory frame. It was a crude masquerade, a mockery of the human form that would have been laughable if it weren't so deeply unnatural. The gate creaked. A heavy, uneven step crunched across the frozen yard. It was not the light, rhythmic gait of their mother, but something weightier, more deliberate. The children froze, the air in the room suddenly turning as cold as the mountain peak. Then came the voice. It was a sound that didn't belong in a throat of flesh. It was a coarse, gravelly mimicry of their mother's tone, sounding like dry leaves being crushed under a heavy stone. The words it formed were familiar, speaking of tteok and a long journey, but the cadence was wrong. Too slow, too rhythmic, as if the speaker were tasting the very air to find the right shape for the sounds. The children approached the door, their hands hovering over the latch. Through the thin paper of the sliding door, the moon cast a silhouette that made their blood turn to ice. The figure standing there was draped in their mother's clothes, but the proportions were skewed. The shoulders were too broad, the posture too hunched, and from beneath the hem of the long skirt, a thick, tufted tail twitched with an impatient, predatory hunger. The shadow against the paper didn't breathe. It waited. It was the presence of a void, a darkness that had learned to speak and dress in the skin of their world. As the latch began to slide open, the smell of wet fur and iron-rich blood seeped through the cracks, announcing that the sanctuary had already been breached. The mother they longed for was gone, and in her place stood a nightmare wearing her face. The latch clicked, and the door swung open with a heavy, resigned groan. In the dim, flickering light of the single candle, the intruder sat in the corner, shrouded in the stolen garments of their mother. The children did not rush to embrace her. Instead, they stood rooted, paralyzed by a primal recognition that skipped the mind and went straight to the marrow. The air in the room grew thick with the metallic tang of dried blood and the pungent, musky odor of the wild. As the mother reached out a hand, the light caught the long, curved talons peeking through the sleeves. It was not the soft, calloused hand of a weaver, but a weapon of bone and fur. The siblings shared a single, silent look, a collision of terror and the sudden sharp clarity of the hunted. They did not scream. A scream would have been an invitation. Moving with a fluid, desperate grace born of pure adrenaline, they slipped toward the back of the cottage. While the beast feasted on its own arrogance, thinking the prey cornered, the children vanished through the narrow wooden door leading to the rear garden. The cold night air hit their faces like a slap, shocking their lungs into action. Behind them, the house erupted. The masquerade was over. A roar, stripped of its human mask, tore through the paper walls, followed by the splintering of wood as the tiger realized the cage was empty. They ran. Their bare feet bled against the frozen earth, but they felt nothing but the rhythmic pounding of their own hearts. At the edge of the clearing stood an ancient tree, its branches reaching toward the stars like a skeletal hand. It was their only hope, a vertical sanctuary in a world that had turned horizontal and predatory. They climbed. The rough bark tore at their palms and the wind whipped around them, but they ascended with a strength they didn't know they possessed. Below them, the shadow arrived, a mass of muscle and fury that circled the trunk with a low, frustrated growl. The distance between the earth and the sky had never felt so small, yet so insurmountable. As they looked down, they saw the amber eyes staring up, waiting for gravity to do what the mountain could not. The tiger began its ascent. With a cruel, mocking intelligence, it had discovered the notches in the bark, perhaps left by the children's own frantic grip, or perhaps carved by its own jagged claws. The sound was rhythmic and inexorable, the scrape of bone against wood, the low, wet huff of a predator that knew its meal was finally within reach. High above, perched on the highest, most fragile branches, the children felt the tree shudder with the weight of the beast. They were trapped between the hungry earth and the silent stars. There was no more room to run, no more strength to climb. The world of men had failed them, and the world of nature was closing in. It was in this moment of absolute darkness that a different kind of strength took hold. It was not the strength of muscle, but the strength of a plea that transcended the physical. They did not speak to each other, they spoke to the void, to the ancient spirits that watched from the constellations above. Their prayer was not a whisper of words, but a silent vibration of the soul. It was a demand for justice from a universe that often seemed indifferent. They asked the heavens to prove that the light still held power over the shadow. If we are meant to survive, their spirits cried out into the cold ether, grant us a path that the earth cannot provide. If we are pure, send down a golden thread. But if we are tainted, let the rope be rotten, and let the end be swift. The atmosphere shifted. The wind, which had been a howling enemy, suddenly fell into a dead, expectant calm. The stars seemed to pulse with a sudden, blinding intensity, and for a heartbeat, time itself ceased to flow. Then the sky tore open. A single thick cord of golden light descended from the zenith of the heavens. It was not made of hemp or silk, but of woven sunbeams and ancestral promises. It dropped through the canopy, shimmering with a celestial warmth that pushed back the freezing mountain air. As the children reached out to grasp the rope, the tiger's breath was already hot upon their heels. The beast's claws were inches from the branch, but the golden cord was firm, humming with a power that shook the very foundations of the mountain. They were no longer mere children of the forest. They were being pulled toward a destiny that would change the face of the sky forever.